Turks and barely Arabs. Suggests that other historians have also echoed Zülker's argument by describing the young Turk leadership as traumatized and committed to launching a violent project of societal transformation in order to secure a Turkish nation state. The Young Turks policies thus took place in the ethnically heterogeneous Ottoman eastern provinces, which also had a significant portion of the Ottoman Armenian population. And this is where the Said's quote of looking at the overlapping territories becomes extremely important in revisiting historiography. So the perpetrators of the genocide were not the terrible Turks or alien Asiatics, as Europeans used to describe the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. They were secular, European-born and European-educated Turkish nationalists fighting to establish a nation-state following European models of modernity. And this is how authors like Michael Mann in his Dark Side of Democracy situate the genocidal projects on the Armenians and elsewhere as part and parcel of European modernity and nation building. In the imagination of the founding elites, then, Anatolia was a substitute for the lost homelands in the Balkans, and Muslims were a substitute for Armenians in Anatolia. Although Anatolia was a foreign country to them at the time, the terrain was constructed by Balkan-born Ottoman Muslims as a compensation for their lost homelands in the European Ottoman provinces. Throughout the 20th century, as we've heard from Mihran earlier, Anatolia were to continue to host many expelled and massacred Muslims, such as Bosnians, Bulgarians, Crimean Tatars from the Balkans, the Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Union. As Muslims from ex-Ottoman territories, they were then received and assimilated within the Turkish majoritarianism of the state as Turks. Thus, the racialization and annihilation of Armenian population of Anatolia took place as the Turkish nationalists were reinventing Anatolia as a Turkish homeland and forging a demographic majority from the diverse Muslim populations from the Balkans and those who already existed in Anatolia. So let us look at the details of how this process of creating a majority took place. And I really think, after doing enough research on this, that it is very common to study minority populations. But I think it is by far more important to study majoritarianism. Because after all, a minority becomes a minority once we exclude the minority as we define the inclusion of a majority. So let's dig into the main meaning. In the last session of the Ottoman Parliament, 28th of January 1920, the Ottoman Parliament defined what was to become Turkey as in the terms of an ethno-sectarian Muslim state. During this session, the Ottoman parliamentarians, who included members of the Ankara government, led by Mustafa Kemal. At the time, there were two governments, the Ottoman government led by the Sultan in Istanbul, and the Ankara government ran parallel, opposing the Sultan, run by the Young Turks that I just told you about the profile, headed by Mustafa Kemal, who later called himself Atatürk. So they consolidated what was called the Misak-i Milli, or the National Pact, that defined the territories that would become Turkey in the following terms. So Article 1 of the pact said the following, and I quote: "The territories inhabited by an Ottoman Muslim majority, united in race, religion, and aim, formed an indivisible whole. But the fate of the territories inhabited by an Arab majority, which was under foreign occupation, should be determined by a vote by the local populations." Unquote. It is notable that it did not advocate a Turkish national sovereignty, but rather an Ottoman Muslim one, following the Ottoman practice that those who belong to Islam, or especially Sunni Islam, are the ruling sect of the empire, known as the Millati Hakime, the ruling millet. This fact meant that the pact's authors turned the diverse Muslim ethno-linguistic and sectarian groups such as Kurds, Alawis, Turks, and others, with the exception of Arabs, because the French and the British at the time claimed the Arab provinces through Sykes-Picot and other policies. So these diverse groups became a majority that would later be forced to assimilate into a Turkish ethno-sectarian state. And those who refuse assimilation in Turkishness, the Kurdish example then becomes, demonstrates what happens for those Muslim population that refuses to become Turks. This definition was asserted by Mustafa Kemal himself, where he said the following: the assembly, the people whom this assembly represents, are not only Turks, are not only Cherkess, and are not only Kurds, and are not only Laz. The nation that we are here to preserve and defend is, of course, is composed of various Muslim elements. This was a speech by Mustafa Kemal in 1921. The founders of the Republic followed a European imagination of modernity in establishing a secular nation state. So the fact that having a Muslim majority does not mean that it is not sectarian, it is not secular, because secularism here was to invent something similar to France, and the French model of nation-state building was very central in modeling Turkey. As long as everyone is Catholic, then you can speak of secularism in France. But there was a Jewish question in France in the 1800s, and currently a Muslim question. So, and this is where Turkish secularism and Muslim majoritarianism comes, or are intertwined in a very interesting way. While their assumption shared some aspects of Western Orientalism of the pre-modern era and the supposed backwardness of Islam and the Orient, they were also part of the Ottoman Turkish self-definition of being modernized, yet modernized in a secular Muslim way. Following the example of the Balkans, ethno-sectarian states where Christian affiliation became the ethnic identity of the majority, Turkish nationalists named adherence to Islam as a marker of Turkishness. The annihilation of Armenian population and forced exchange of the Roman Orthodox Christians with Muslims of Greece were two critical events that contribute to the realization of the image of Turkey as an ethno-sectarian state for the non-Arabic speaking Ottoman Muslims. We've already seen the many levels of exclusions here. Now to the second one, which is the Lausanne Treaty. Following the Armenian genocide, the Greco-Turkish treaty that was negotiated and signed in Lausanne in 1922 and 23 was another critical event for racializing and altering demographics. After the defeat of the Greek campaign in Anatolia by the Turkish forces led by Mustafa Kemal, Turkey negotiated a peace treaty with Greece under the auspices of Britain and France. The Lausanne Treaty, which became an intellectual obsession for 3 years in a row, provided for me grounds for the first large-scale ethnic cleansing in the international legal system. Under the treaty, as many as 350,000 Muslims, many of them were Greek-speaking, had to flee Greece to Turkey simply because they are Muslims. And up to 1.2 million Orthodox Christians, many of whom were Turkish speakers, had to go to Greece as Greeks because they were simply Orthodox Christians. The only two populations that were spared the exchange were the Orthodox population of Istanbul with the Patriarchate of Constantinople, around 120,000 Orthodox Christians, and around 120,000 Muslims in Eastern Thrace. So when Greeks, I heard a lot of Greeks tell us, oh, after 500 years or 400 years of Turkish rule, of course they call it Turkish, not Ottoman, we only have 1% of our population Muslim, and they say it with great pride. Well, obviously, yes, when you exchange the entire population, this is what you're going to do. I mean, that's not a miracle that this happened. But how is this related to Armenians? What is silence from the final text of the Lausanne Treaty and historiography in general is the centrality of the Armenian question to the negotiations of the treaty. The Armenian question had been largely ignored in assessments of the final text of the treaty and in subsequent historical and academic study on the Armenian citizens and of Turkey and the conference itself. You can rarely find even a mention that there was how central was the Armenian delegation to the conference, and they sparked a lot of debates about who was to be considered a minority and who's not, who is to be represented and who's not. I mean, I can tell you about it more, I can go on forever about that in the question and answer if you want. The Armenians who remained in Turkey after the conclusion of the conference started to be governed according to a treaty negotiated by the Greek and Turkish states, each of which sought to defend its respective ethno-sectarian minority retained within the border of the other state. The Armenians who were not allowed to have a representative in the official proceeding to advocate for their loss of lives and property had no say in the future of the newly founded state, but they started to be governed by the articles of the Lausanne Treaty. Now, the treaty had three implications for Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East. First, it contributed to the racialization of the Ottoman population based on sectarian lines, turning the diverse Ottoman Muslims into Turks. To this end, the Turkish delegation at the conference prevented the diverse Muslim population in Anatolia, as Kurds, Alawis, and Laz, and so on, to be racialized or even recognized in the international legal system as minorities. If they were divided on ethnic and sectarian terms, like the non-Muslims, there would have been no demographic majority of what was to become Turkey. And this is where majoritarianism deserves more attention because of the exclusion of minorities, as I said, are a byproduct of majoritarian rule. The residual non-Muslim population in Turkey, the Armenians, the Roman Orthodox, and the Jews, were consequently prevented from becoming full Turkish citizens because their sectarian affiliation rendered them non-Turks. Non-Muslims becomes non-Turks. But now the implication on this that hasn't been studied is what happens to Muslim population like the Kurds who are Muslims but they refuse to become Turks. We get the Kurdish question, which started around 18 months after the signing of the Lausanne Treaty. We get the first Kurdish revolt, the Sheikh Said revolt in 1925. For this reason, the Turkish delegation at Lausanne conference vehemently objected to the inclusion of Ottoman Armenians in the negotiation because they were not represented by the state, and that is another implication where only states were to be represented in the conference. Non-state actors, different population minority groups were not allowed an entry under any condition in the international legal system at the time. And the third implication of the treaty was establishing ethnic cleansing as a legal solution in international conflicts through treaties that allow involuntary expulsion of unwanted populations. And here I will give you two examples that you might find surprising. The Zionist movement also discussed the model of the Lausanne Treaty whereby Jews from the Arab states would replace Palestinians to achieve demographic majority of a Jewish ethno-sectarian state. And this was the recommendation of the Peel Commission of 1936-1937. The second example is not from the Middle East or the Balkans, but from the British colony of India, which witnessed the largest number of expulsion in a legal system where 13 million people in the British colony of India, as Pakistan and India became independent. In that case, Pakistan was designated as a territory for the Southeast Asian Muslims, a step that would allow India to have a significant Hindu majority. So these are how far the Lausanne Treaty had effect, not only on an ongoing conflict in Palestine, but also as far as India and the exchange of population between the two. The next minute, I just want to say a couple of concluding remarks. So in this talk, I have demonstrated the ways in which racialization and the creation of minorities and majorities occurred in some successor states of the Ottoman Empire. Situating Anatolian Armenians as an ethnographic perspective opens a venue for understanding the predicament of other populations such as Balkan Muslims and Anatolian Kurds in Turkey. By juxtaposing the multiple victimhood of different groups, we contextualize the demographic ramification of post-imperial nationalist states that have been obscured by academic and political discourses. In this sense, such a perspective not only doesn't only tell us about the marginal populations but sheds new light on the formation of a center that engendered multiple layered systems of exclusion. And here, if we are thinking about Turkey as excluding Armenians, then we can speak about how Turkish nationalism not only excluded Armenians, but that layer of it created different layers of, this is what happens when we talk about the Balkans. Layers of exclusion where the religious Muslims were excluded, Alawis are excluded, Kurds are excluded, and those who, any group that doesn't want to fit, Marxists were excluded in the 1950s and 60s in Turkey. So it is very important if we are launching that perspective, and that's why I don't consider this to be a work on a minority group. I'm using a minority group as a perspective to analyze the multiple layers of exclusion on the center, by the center. So the Republic of Turkey was fashioned in the image of Greece and other Balkan Christian states and based its citizenship on sectarian affiliation. So out of what is now Turkey used to be around 20% non-Muslim among the Armenians and Orthodox and Jews and so on. When Turkey was established in 1923, the 20% were reduced to 2.3%, and now it is at 0.1%. But this is not the interesting part. On the other side of Europe, Middle East border, the Muslim populations of the Balkans share a similar predicament, yet they continue to be understudied and underrepresented and subverted between the discourses of Islamophobia in Europe on one hand, and the continuous focus on the discrimination against Middle East Christians on another hand. So no one wants to speak about Balkan Muslims. Furthermore, the fact that the Turkish state continues to deny the Armenian genocide by quoting the suffering experienced by the Balkan Muslims has hindered the recognition of suffering among various populations in this post-imperial nationalist setting. Recent works on empires have tended to focus on the non-dominant confessional and ethnic group. And here I'm using the word non-dominant in order to avoid the word minorities. In the Ottoman case, the violence against those groups experienced in the late 19th and early 20th century overshadowed the long history of coexistence and tolerance. Many of us, the memory of the Ottoman Empire goes as far as 1912, the Balkan Wars. Consequently, discrimination against Muslim groups who do not affiliate with the Sunni sect is rendered unworthy of examination, as I said, because of the Ottoman Empire had Sunni Islam or Muslims as the ruling millet, and therefore it became a state for that ruling millet, and therefore within Turkey we don't hear again any kind of discourse or discrimination against the Alawis and the Kurds. Actually, it's against the law to speak about Kurds and Alawis in Turkey, up until recently, because then you're dividing the Turkish nation. Very much like the French constitution that says that the French nation is indivisible. So you cannot speak about Algerian French or Jewish French and so on. That indivisibility of the nation. So Ottoman Armenians as an ethnographic perspective allow us to situate and contextualize the examination of marginal groups. On this, one is Ottoman space to recognize the majoritarian polities and the many layers of victimhood. One is due to their recognition as minorities, and the other as, sorry, I already said that. So, conclusion. It is thus imperative for us as anthropologists, social scientists, and historians to avoid blind spots, such as those that arise from favoring some victim populations and ignore others that lurk underneath this seemingly homogeneous, majoritarian, invisible. To challenge the state-centered categories of minorities and majorities, one must move in oppositional tracks between sites, categories, and borders, and renegotiate identities imposed by the colonial and nationalist regimes. The production of such knowledge aims to open up new horizons for solidarity. Here I'm quoting Donna Haraway, where she says, opens new horizons for solidarity in politics and shared convergence in epistemology, unquote. Because the inclusion of subjugated groups lead us to, she says, more adequate, sustained, objective, transforming accounts of the world. and not merely for the regions and population discussed here. Furthermore, the study of marginal groups not only reveal important and subtle ethnographic and historical nuances about the population under study, but it rather also opens up new venues to understand the center from the vantage point of the marginal. I believe that unearthing the many strata of victimhood and exclusion means imagining a more inclusive and humane future that transcends the binaries of majorities and minorities, victims and victimizers. And I believe that anthropologists and historians and other social scientists, through the very act of oppositional modes of representation, are in a position to contribute to such good endeavor. Thank you.
Thanks. Very interesting, brilliant lecture, touching on, I think, all the many questions that are still roaming around us in the moment. I open the floor for questions, discussions. Please, Dr. Mubarak.
Can you elaborate on the stuff you didn't go into, the precise ways in which the Armenian voice was silenced at the Lausanne events and how that unfolded, could you say?
It's actually lots of fun, and it deserves a film, because the Armenian delegation, and this was not, these I found from the minutes of the British delegation, and some of the diplomatic telegraphs that the Ankara government was sending to the Turkish delegation in Lausanne revealed a lot of interesting things behind the scenes. One of them, the Armenian delegation was not represented, but they were staying in the same hotel as the Turkish delegation. So the way was the Armenian delegation was communicating with the Turkish delegation was basically putting letters and posting letters and notes on the hotel room of İsmet İnönü, who was the head of the Turkish delegation, who later became the Turkish president after Mustafa Kemal. And the head of the Armenian delegation was the ex-Ottoman Minister of Foreign Affairs. So up until the Armenian genocide in 1914, the foreign minister of the Ottoman Empire was Armenian. In 5 or 6, 7 years later, he was trying to negotiate with the Ottoman state as a minority. That is not included in what was to become Turkey. This was the interesting thing. So many instances, the funny episode was İsmet İnönü. Every time the French and the British brought the Armenian question, he either left the room or pretended that he didn't hear, that he had a hearing problem. So he either left the room and he walked out a couple of times when the British and the French were insisting that the Armenians to be represented. And İsmet İnönü said that they are not a state. We came here to negotiate a state with states. We cannot include. And if you want to include the Armenians, then we need to include, listen to this, they need to include a delegation from the Bulgarians, a delegation from the Bosnian Muslims, and then he said, and also a delegation from Ireland, right? Because at the time there was an Irish crisis for the British Empire. And after that, the British stopped pushing the inclusion of the Armenians in the delegation. Now the British and the French did not want the Armenians to be included because they wanted justice for Armenians. It was a diplomatic trick to punish Turkey, because all the states that sided with Germany in World War I ended up punished through the Paris Peace Conference. The Bulgarians, the Ottomans with the Treaty of Sèvres, the Germans with the Treaty of Versailles, and the Bulgarians with the Treaty of Neuilly, which are suburbs of Paris, each one. And they all basically were meant to punish those states. Now, obviously, the Treaty of Versailles ended up with the Nazis coming to power at another war, and the Treaty of Sèvres was never approved by the the Ottoman Parliament and was never applied, was not even cancelled. So the Treaty of Sèvres was dividing what is now Turkey among a Greek state, an Armenian state, an Italian state, a British state, a French state. Central Anatolia was to become for the Turks, for Muslims, and Istanbul and the Straits were to become an international zone. And this is what Mustafa Kemal and the young Turks were mean when they say that it's a war, it's an anti-colonial war.
And
The war
this
of
is in the
independence.
British diplomatic records, it's available to
It is available, yeah, that's the Treaty of Sèvres. So basically, to go back to the Armenians, so they wanted to continue to punish the Turks, although the Turkish armies at the time were able to expel the Greeks, because the British told the Greeks, if you invade, we're going to support you, and they never did. It's common, right? It's common in the Greek diplomacy, the British diplomacy, and Turkey was on the winning side, was winning when they entered the negotiations of Lausanne. So the French and the British said, if we were then include the Armenians to negotiate for an Armenian state or semi-independent state in Anatolia, and the other thing they were fighting for was to regard the Kurds, the Alawis, the Cherkess, and the Bosnians, and all of these groups that were all Muslims, to be all treated as minorities. Mm-hmm. And this is when Reza Nur, when he was assistant to Inani as a Turkish delegate, he was a doctor, said in his memoir, and they wanted to scatter us like cotton. And he was, because he ended up being excluded from the Ottoman Turkish political elite at the time, so he wrote a memoir saying that how he contributed to the making of the Turkish nation, and one of his contribution is that was by saying that, and it was because of me that all of these groups were not considered as minorities, because if they did, they would have had no majority to fight for the independence of Turkey. It would have been basically small bulk, like the Balkans, even worse, because there was no majority in Anatolia. So it's lots of fun, and I'm working on a piece on that. I hope that I get it out soon, because it's a story that deserves.
No Turkic majority or no Sunni majority?
No, the bigger umbrella was Sunni Islam, but no Turkish majority.
No Turkish
because you
majority,
had,
and no ethnic Turkish majority.
yes, yes. And that's why for them, they were fighting for an Ottoman, for a Muslim state. They didn't say Turkish at the time. But later on, and with the foundation of the state, the word Muslim became Turkish. And this is when the Kurds started revolting against the Turkish state starting in 1920, which is basically less than 18 months from the signing of the Lausanne Treaty. The Kurds started revolting against Turkey. Against the Sheikh Said revolt. The rest is history.
So we're dealing with between 1914 to around about 1923 to 1928. Is that right?
23.
That's the sort of time span. If what were the requirements at that time of Britain and France as imperial powers? One, vis-a-vis their colonies that they still had, and two, in contradiction, conflict to each other, that impacted on this process.
What was the first point you said?
I don't know. What was the contradiction between, what was the need of the Anglo-French empires vis-a-vis their colonies, and what were the contradictions between them, the major ones, that impacted on the process that you just described?
Well, that's a good question, because it allows us to even zoom out a little bit. There was, again, the Russian Empire, and that always wanted to have a...
So we've had the revolution back then.
Oh, yes. Well, we know about Sykes-Picot because the Soviets exposed it. They refused to join it. That's how it was. But part of it was basically the British and the French were in competition on one level, but they were also worked hand in hand in order to help each other. So when we look at the division of the Ottoman provinces, whether Anatolia or the Middle East, it was nicely divided. among them, and part of it was also to secure the colonies through trade, through military. The main concern of the empire, especially in the Lausanne negotiation, was the security of the straits. So the question of Istanbul and the straits that link the Mediterranean to the Asian, to the Marmara, to the Black Sea, was paramount for both parties. And that's why the exchange of population was meant. If you have an IR person here or a political scientist, the Lausanne Treaty for them is not ethnic cleansing, is a great success, because we don't see any regional wars between the Greeks and the Turks. And the straits have remained more or less open for trade and other functions. So, and this was the aim of the negotiation at the time, was to secure that and limit the power of Turkey. They did not want a strong Turkey in the region, especially on the border of Europe. Get the Ottomans out and punish Turkey to a weak state. And this is basically, and they tried everything and they didn't manage to do it, because Turkey ended up with a big chunk of territory, but only very small part of Europe. So Turkey was completely out of Europe and out of the islands, the Greek islands. So I would say it was basically the security of the straits, and to secure or have no competition in their claims over the Arab provinces. Because when you look at, when we read the Misaki Milli, the first article said that the nation is united in race and religion for the Muslims, and then the Arab provinces were to be decided by under occupation, were to be decided by vote on the local level. So they didn't want to challenge. The Turks didn't want to challenge the colonial claims of Britain and France. And that is, in a way, also affected the Armenians, because the majority of Armenians who survived did not leave during the genocide. They actually left in 1920, when the Turkish revolutionists and the French signed the Treaty of Ankara, where the French acknowledged Turkish control over southern Anatolia. So the border that we have now between Syria and Turkey, but it included Antakya and Iskenderun within Syria, that border was determined in 1920, but between the French and the Turkish nationalists, the Young Turks. After that, the Armenians, around 60,000 Armenians, arrived to Paris, to Marseille, on boats, because the French ceded that part of southern Anatolia to the Turks. And then the Turks, in return, they wouldn't ask for any of the Ottoman provinces from the French. So it was that kind of deal. And the Ankara Treaty, it took me some time to find its provisions. It's completely neglected. But
1920, you said?
1920, the Ankara Treaty. It was a very small treaty between the French and the Turks at the time. And then later in 1939, they ended up giving Antioch and Iskenderun to Turkey in order to side with them in World War II. The war ended, and Turkey never entered the war, but they kept Antioch. So that's so it is.
Was there any possibility of exchange possibilities for the Armenian population, where they offered any kind of exchange, that they moved to Greece, or or where the only solution for them was?
They were hoping. Thank you for this, because the negotiation, one of the telegrams that came from Ankara to Lausanne, it was telling Inami, try to negotiate an exchange for the Armenians, just like the Greeks. Anatolian Armenians, those who remained. And the answer came back and to Ankara said, we cannot negotiate, there is no one to negotiate such an exchange with.
They're not the state.
They are not the state, but no one, I mean, I was expecting a question about Soviet Armenia. Where is Soviet Armenia in all of this? Soviet Armenia at the time gained independence for a very short period, and then it became part of the Soviet Union. But the Turkish nationalists, in order to secure their eastern borders and southern borders, they signed the Treaty of Moscow with the Soviet Union, and then signed the Treaty of Ankara with the French, which meant that they only had the Western Front with the Greeks to fight. So the answer was, if we would negotiate an exchange of Armenians with any of the Muslim population in Armenia, then we need to revisit the Treaty of Moscow, which might mean that they have to renegotiate the borders of Turkey with the Soviet Union. And the Turks did not want to go to that route whatsoever. So they said that there's actually a line in the telegram that says that we are going to leave them as they are, make them citizens, and deal with them in the long term.
And all after, during the massacres, during the genocide?
No, that's after the genocide.
That was in 1919?
Yeah, we're talking about after the war.
Okay.
And then, and this is where the story of Mihran, my ethnography comes in, right? Where he said, when there was systematic policy of emptying Anatolia from Armenians by, if a landlord would come and take an Armenian land, then the Armenians would go to the police or the gendarme at the time to the answer they get, we cannot help you, you need to sort it out. So in a way, the southeast of Anatolia was ruled as military land, and they left the Armenian population under the mercy of the Kurdish landlords. But every Armenian who remained in Anatolia remained because he was saved by a Kurdish family. So the loyalty became to the Kurds. So in terms of marriage, abduction of women, and confiscation of land, on one hand, the state didn't want to interfere because the state had its own relationship with the Kurdish landlords in order to suppress the Kurdish revolts. Okay. And on another level, the majority of Armenians were treated by the Turkish state as Kurds because they were part of the Kurdish tribal system. So the Iskan Kanunu, the settlement law of 1934, they fragmented the entire region by taking a village and sending its inhabitants to 3 or 4 parts of Western Turkey. And they did not allow them to return. So to enter the southeast, you had to basically cross the border. It was under military rule, and that was to deal with the Kurdish revolts. That was, that's part of a larger article that I'm writing. And in that sense, the perspective of Ottoman Armenians makes us understand the Balkans better, but also makes us understand the making of the Kurdish problem in a different way.
Yes, please.
Sorry, unless there's any other questions. Can I push you a little bit more then to speak about, because you mentioned the silencing, and you talked about methodology also in terms of the class that you're teaching as well. Yes. This notion of non-material archives, memory and songs, and this is why I'd like to push you more to speak about your ethnography, because the sort of the information you've given us, and again that's why I asked you about the sources, is very much state archive, written archival sources, diplomatic records, etc. And it seems to corroborate your oral histories, I guess we can call them. Aren't there any tensions between these two types of archives that one can, are they telling the same story? What does your ethnography sort of reveal in terms of just nuancing and problematizing these stories? Because then it would suggest that it's not silence, that it is in the archive, you just have to wait for it, and it'll take you a long time to get to it, but it's there. It's not the same as recovering histories that are silenced by national apparatuses such as the state.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
I very much see what you mean.
Yeah.
And I thank you for it, because I think this allows me to dig a little bit into basically the theoretical and conceptual framework of the research. There are two things here, and to take it into consider what you just said. The first thing is there are a few fragments in the archives that it's going to take you some time to find, okay? Which is basically what I've done when I looked at the archives of the Turkish diplomatic correspondence in Lausanne and the minutes and the minutes of the British delegation. Okay, and when you read into these documents, you really realize that how central was the Armenian negotiation. But the question comes in then what happened after Lausanne? Okay, what happened after Lausanne? This is where the ethnography comes in. Because the Armenian population in Turkey, so the ethnographies and interviews like the one of Mihran, for example, there is no way to document that the Turkish state asked Armenians to leave. You won't find that. There is no way you can say, for example, so the statistics that I quoted at the beginning, and that's to link it, I usually don't like to quote statistics, but I did because of the difference in numbers, tells us 24,000 Armenians remained in all of Anatolia. But there is no way to verify that. Okay? Primarily because some Armenians were already, well, who's an Armenian? Right? If someone has an Armenian parent, is he an Armenian or a Kurd? Or she's an Armenian or a Kurd? We don't know. And out of fear, who's going to tell that to a statistic government functionary, I am an Armenian, where Armenians were basically living in the shadow of the genocide and mass annihilation. So the statistics can tell us. Now, I tried to look at church archives. Now, did Armenians, I'm sure someone had got baptized or married or at least a funeral. Now, the majority of churches were closed after the genocide. And in the big cities, there were churches, like, for example, Kayseri, there was a church, Diyarbakir, there was a church, and some few other villages here and there, but not everywhere. And the archives were moved to Istanbul because when the fighting started with the Kurds, a lot of Armenians had to leave, especially almost no one remained by the 1980, which was at the height of the PKK Turkish state. So the church archives are not there as well. Now, the other most important thing about silence is what do we call what happened to Armenians in Anatolia? Because genocide really is a legal term, is a term in international law that I am using. But Armenians in Anatolia, from different parts of Anatolia, would call what happened depending on their experience of it. So some Armenians call it Seferberlik, which means mass mobilization in Turkish, which basically they discovered, they experienced the genocide during the mobilization of the Ottoman army during the war. They don't refer it as mass killing. Some Armenians in the mountainous regions call it kafila. Kafila means caravan in Arabic, because they were marching into the desert. Okay, so is it Seferberlik or is it kafile? Right? I mean, these are the local terms. And this is the problem again with the discourse of genocide that the Armenian diaspora institutions try to capitalize because they have a legal and political aim. But my aim is yes, political, but I don't have a legal aim here. So it also homogenizes the Armenian experience in another way. So, and in that I do explore the different experiences of different parts of Anatolia, and each one has its own word, either in Armenian or Turkish and sometimes in Arabic. So these are all silenced episodes that are not documented. Maybe Kafile, you will find it I found it in a novel by an Armenian from Diyarbakir, Migrdich Margosyan. He spoke a little bit about Kafile, for example. So literature is another way of trying to go around, because again, whatever is not said by people are usually said through novelists, or even there are even some work on the lullabies, how the Armenian lullabies of Armenian women in Istanbul speak about the violence. For example, a lullaby, I know of an Armenian lullaby that says, instead of putting the child to sleep, it says, "Come, wake up, my child, wake up. Let's go to our Van, let's go to our Sasun." These are two villages in Anatolia. Because in our absence, the stones are shedding tears. That's a lullaby. So then you can come to those ruptures or flashes, to use Walter Benjamin, that come out and break that silence. So thank you for this
By the way,
question.
the memory of the Armenians in Kassab or Deir ez-Zor, for example, no archives, they didn't carry archives with them when they're moving, we don't know. Or, any interviews or oral history.
Oral history now in Turkey, they are collecting oral history of those who remain in Turkey, but I don't know what happened with those in Deir ez-Zor. A lot of them ended up in Halab or Beirut or Lebanon, obviously, which I went to Halab trying to find the archives of Mardin and Diyarbakir through the church, and they told me you have to go to either Istanbul or Deir ez-Zor. I didn't go, but when you go to Istanbul, you ask, are the archives of the Anatolian churches in Istanbul? Then they tell you, oh, we have no idea about it. This is someone from the Armenian patriarch told me, oh, we don't know. So please, if you come across anything, can you please tell us? Okay. And I heard that they were scared that the archives would be destroyed in Istanbul, so they will move to Jerusalem. Somehow, as if Jerusalem is safer for Armenians. I don't know, but there was always a challenge about and I made a joke. I once told an Armenian journalist in Istanbul that I met him and he asked me, so were you able to find the documents you want? I told him, well, I'm going to tell you something, that it is easier for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a researcher into an Armenian archive. So he laughed and he told me, well, that's basically what I had to go through. So as far as I'm concerned, they don't exist. And even if they exist, because of the political tension in Turkey, they are not open. And they are even not open for Armenians, because if I go from outside of the circle of the church hierarchy, there was no hope. Especially that I say I come from Egypt. Arabs don't have the best image in Turkey. I have a Turkish name. I'm a suspect. They thought that I was an informer to the Turks in France, the Armenians in France. So my genealogy doesn't help. I always invoke my Armenian great-grandfather, but he came from Mardin, and Mardin is an Arabic-speaking, not Armenian-speaking, so they don't consider the Armenians to be real Armenians.
Your grandfather is not Armenian.
So anyway, I mean, I've tried all the tricks, and this is where basically looking at that I'm developing that concept of the non-material archive. Particularly because that's the only thing that I was able to find.
Any other questions or comments? Hakim, thanks for the brilliant lecture.
Thank you for the opportunity.
The discussion now afterwards was very enriching. Please join us for some sweets and. We'll send you